Hello, welcome to this presentation that will describe the less common species of dragonflies and damselflies occurring in Britain. In this presentation, I'm going to be looking at the 21 least common species of the 45 that we know breed in the UK. If you want to look at the commoner species, then there's an accompanying YouTube video entitled The Common Species, and there's also an introductory presentation video covering the biology and the general introduction to Britain's dragonflies. So you can find these either on my YouTube channel or the British Dragonfly Society's YouTube channel. And if you want to read more about any of these, of course, then by all means have a look at this wonderful book. So just a little quick recap. We have basically 12 groups that we could put our dragonflies and damselflies into. Of these, half of them, there are 6 groups of damselflies and 6 groups, if you like, of dragonflies. And the damselflies include the large demoiselles, which are both common and widespread across Britain. The blue tails, one of which is very common and one of which is not. The spread wings, one of which is common but declining, and others which are rare. The bluets, a couple of which are very common and others which are much less common. The red damsels, one of which is very common and another of which isn't. And then the red eyes, both of these are common and covered in the other presentation. The dragonflies include the chasers, one of which is relatively scarce. The skimmers, 2 species which are both quite common and covered in the other presentation. And the darters, some of which are common, others of which are much less so. Of the hawkers and emperors, we have a mix of both common and rare species. The golden ring and clubtail we've lumped together for convenience, but the golden ring is pretty common and widespread, particularly in the west of Britain. The clubtail much more restricted. And then we have emerald dragonflies, and the emeralds are all rather scarce and local. So a recent analysis of 50 years worth of data in the UK showed that these 21 species, the ones I'm going to cover here, had the lowest frequencies of occupancy in 1 kilometre squares, or monads. And the results of this, if you're interested, are available in much more detail in the State of Dragonflies in Britain and Ireland 2021. But you can see there in that listing we've got willow emerald at 5.5% occupancy, right down to the much more localized southern, northern and Irish damselflies. Okay, so we have 10 uncommon damselfly species, which I'm going to cover here, and the commoner species have been greyed out. These you can find information on in the accompanying presentation. And then we have one damsel that's occurred as a vagrant, the common winter damsel, of which there are just a couple of records up to 2022. Dragonflies, we also have 11 uncommon breeding species, and again the commoner ones are greyed out. There's a few alternative names in brackets there that are used more widely across Europe. And then bottom right we have quite a long list of migrants and vagrants, so species that may or may not occur annually. Most of them don't occur annually, and I'm not going to be covering these. We have no proof of successful breeding of any of these species. So I'm afraid you'll have to buy Britain's Dragonflies if you want to see more details on those. The small red damselfly is the smaller of two red species of damselflies that we have in Britain. Now the large red is very common and widespread, but the small red, as you can see from the map, is very localised, mainly in southern England and West Wales. It's very much a habitat specialist and often found associated with bog mosses on heathland ponds and flushes, and sometimes on the moorland fringe, but typically it likes fairly warm areas, and it is very localized, so even within those shaded areas it's not particularly common. Now that little phrase, the small red is all red, is a good one to remember, because the small red lacks the black towards the tip of the abdomen that the large red shows. It can sometimes be difficult to see the dark markings on the tip of a large red because they're shiny and in bright sunlight they sometimes glint and look pale. So if you think you've got a small red, look for other clues as well. Just bear in mind, of course, that mostly you're not going to be seeing small reds because they're so localized. But the small red also has nice red wing spots instead of black wing spots in the large red, and the legs are distinctly reddish or pinkish instead of the black legs of a large red. So there's a large red for comparison, and it is indeed a more substantial insect than the small red, so quite a bit bigger and chunkier and bold and flies around much more quickly. The small red is very weak and low flying. There's the thorax of a small red. Notice on top of the thorax no sign of any stripes, any pale red or yellowish stripes that the large red shows. And then on the side of the thorax there's this quite complex pattern of dark and pale lines and wedges, much more complex than you'll notice on the side of a large red. It's a midsummer species. It flies rather later than the large reds, which are typically the first damselfly to emerge in the spring. So the small red comes out, it's a midsummer species and fizzles out pretty much during August. It has three, like other damselflies, it has several different colour forms, and these are three that you can see in Britain. The typical one, the commonest one at the top there, is mostly black above with a fair bit of red towards the tip of the abdomen and a little bit at the base too. There is a rather confusing all dark form, which is shown there in the middle illustration. Look for the red divisions between the cells, between the segments towards the tip of the abdomen, and those will give you a hint of what you're looking at. And then there is a much less common all red form that looks very like the male. Moving on now to the emerald damselflies, which, as you remember, are the spread wings. They hold their wings open typically. So we have a look-alike here, one that's very similar to the commoner emerald damselfly or common spread wing that we see widely across Britain. The scarce emerald is very localized, as you can see from the map there, and tends to occur at similar sort of times from midsummer onwards. But it shares with common emerald damselfly the blue pruinescence at each end of the abdomen. It also shares, nice greeny bronze upper parts to most of the abdomen and the thorax, and some blue pruinescence around the sides of the thorax too. But there are some subtle differences. So first of all, we'll focus on trying to see the detail of the second abdominal segment. At the base of the abdomen there's quite a large segment which is only partially blue. There's a fairly distinct area of dark, and that's different. The common spreadwing has completely blue segment too. And if we look at the tip of the abdomen, if you can get a high quality photograph taken from above, you will be able to see the detail of the appendages. And in the scarce emerald, the inner or lower appendages are hockey stick shaped, so they curl in noticeably at the tip. And if we compare that with this emerald damselfly, you can see the lower appendages are almost straight. The female scarce emerald has the first abdominal segment squarely cut off in terms of the dark greenish pattern on the top. So it has a rather square-sided edges instead of rounded edges. There's an illustration showing what I mean. Now here's another new kid on the block. The willow emerald damselfly, or the willow spreadwing, has invaded Britain from the southeast. It spread quite substantially. That map is now superseded by a more recent one, which shows spread to the northwards particularly, and to some extent westwards. And as of 2022 there were further further new locations recorded, and I think we fully expect it to spread further westwards and maybe even northwards. They seem to have found a niche here in Britain that they're occupying. They will often be found in trees. The name willow gives you a bit of a clue there, but they can often be found perching above head height. They lay eggs into the branches, the little branches of willows and other trees and shrubs growing on the waterside, and they leave scars behind which will help you to identify where they're present. So you can actually do a little bit of dragonfly recording during the winter with these. They're a late season species, and with increasingly mild autumns we've been seeing them quite well into the autumn, into October or even November. But typically they're a late emerging species. They're a big emerald species. They don't have the pruinescence shown by the robust and the common spreadwing. They have plain green or bronzy upper parts and quite a large, relatively pale wing spot. I mean, don't forget that all dragonflies and damselflies, when they first emerge, have a pale wing spot. So don't be fooled by looking at young emerald damselflies. There are other clues to these to look at. They often hold their wings out a little bit further than other spreadwings. And the male and the female both have a very distinctive pattern on the side of their thorax. So the line, the division between the green above and the yellowish below has a spur. So there's a sort of zigzag marking quite prominent. You do see a little semblance of that sometimes in the robust spreadwing, in the scarce emerald damselfly, but nowhere near as clear as these. And again, if they're perched up in trees, there's every chance there'll be a willow emerald. There we are, that's where the zigzag is. So look for that spur. Looking at the tip of the male, we can see the appendages are actually structurally very different to the robust and common spreadwing. So they have mainly pale whitish or ivory coloured upper or outer appendages with a dark tip, and then the inner or lower appendages are very short. You can hardly see them. So that's a good clue that you're not looking at one of our commoner emerald species. The female has a very robust ovipositor. So the eggs are laid into that woody material. You can see there the pattern of egg scars left on a twig. That robust ovipositor actually has a serrated edge underneath, used for literally soaring into that woody material, or slightly softer woody material that they go for. So a more robust ovipositor than the other spread wings. We've had another rather faltering invasion, I suppose, by the southern emerald damselfly or migrant spreadwing, which has focused very much on southeast England. We do now have a few colonies seemingly breeding successfully each year, but this is a species that, even more so than the other spreadwings, associated with temporary waters, so ephemeral ponds which may dry out. And you will sometimes find them in dry areas, even egg laying in dry areas, where they're anticipating or perhaps hoping that there is going to be autumn rainfall and hence subsequently a nice pond there for the larvae to live in. But it's still not widespread, and a very special one to look out for. The very distinctive feature of these is the fact that they have a black and white wing spot. So they're, well, I was going to say unique, but of course the blue-tailed damselflies have dark and light wing spots. The southern emerald damselfly has even more conspicuous ones. The emeralds all have quite large rectangular shaped wing spots, and these are particularly obvious. You can also see that this male has very pale appendages and some rather clear yellow stripes on the top of the thorax. Otherwise, it's a rather nice pale yellow and bronzy green colour. No pruinescence. So there's the black and white wing spot, which is a good one to focus on. You can see on this individual the thorax has those clear yellow stripes on the top, and also look behind the eyes. You can see a clear division between the dark upper side of the eyes and the rather yellowish lower side. So a very distinctive feature if you've got a close view of them. Here's a mature male. So they do go rather bronzy, and actually this one has got just a teensy bit of pruinescence there. It's got a little bit pruinose on that terminal segment, and there's actually just a slight hint between the wing bases on that image of the thorax. But you can see there's quite a bit of pale towards the tip of the abdomen. The scarce blue-tailed damselfly, as I mentioned just now, shares with the blue tail those black and white wing spots, but it is a very localized, a red list species with some subtle differences from the much commoner, in fact very common, blue-tailed damselfly. You can see from the map there's quite a scattered distribution. It's often in new ponds, so occasionally even in temporary waters like tractor ruts in a quarry or a new pond that's been created in a quarry or elsewhere. But there are some more permanent colonies on lowland heathland particularly, occasionally going up into the moorland areas, but typically it's a southern Mediterranean species. Like the small red, it likes quite hot conditions, so a definite focus towards the south, and it is found on some moorlands and heathlands, so the New Forest, for example, heaths and moors like Dartmoor and the moors of southwest Wales can have them, and they're often associated with muddy areas where livestock have stopped the vegetation from becoming dominant. So this is a species that likes early successional stages, so without too much vegetation. In terms of its identification, focus in the males on the tip of the abdomen, and instead of having a blue segment 8, we have a blue segment 9 and part of segment 8, and actually part of segment 10 too. So the whole blue segment is shifted towards the rear. Otherwise, quite similar. You do get some blue tails that also look quite small in size. So the fact that it's a tiny species isn't an automatic guide to its identification. It's a midsummer species, let's say, but there are hints that in very warm years, and particularly in warm locations in the south, we might have 2 generations. So we may have a spring emergence and then possibly a late summer one. Here's the tip of the abdomen there, showing one of a number of variations in black patterning that there can be, particularly on segment 9. There is the segment 8 blue on the blue-tailed damselfly for comparison. So you can see the position is shifted to the rear. The female scarce blue-tailed, as with other damselflies, comes in several forms, and the immature form is this lovely orange colour. So the base of the abdomen and much of the thorax are this really nice orange, and even orange spreading into the wing veins on the front of the wings. So that's quite a good find. The chances are it's recently emerged, and so you've got a breeding colony there. That's the typical form, so it lacks any blue segment towards the tip of the abdomen, as some of the blue-tailed damselfly females show. And the pattern on the thorax tends to be dark on top, shading down to pale olivey blue on the sides of the thorax, without any obvious blue or any obvious shoulder stripes, blue or otherwise. And there is a very rare blue form of the female that is shown here. So quite a lot of blue, as you can see on this, but notice that thorax pattern mirroring the orange of the one above. So that has matured into a blue colour. Okay, so now let's move on to the bluets, or the blue damselflies, and here we're looking at a mix of common and rare species. So we have the azure second from the left, which is the very common one with that beer glass square U shape on segment 2 of the abdomen, the base of the abdomen. Not easy always to see the detail of the segment 2 markings because they're often covered by the wings. But what we might be looking out for, particularly in fenland sites where the water is alkaline, is the variable damselfly there on the left, which has rather more black on basically all of the abdominal segments, really. Third one in from the left is the southern damselfly, so a very rare, highly localized species, very small, and that has those arrow-shaped markings coming up the abdomen with a so-called mercury mark on segment 2, so quite a complex pattern there. The northern damselfly, which is restricted to Scotland in Britain, has a sort of intermediate, I suppose, between azure and southern patterning, but some suggestion of arrow shapes, particularly on segment 3 of the abdomen, and then those very characteristic mix of a sort of mushroom pattern and then sidelines, if we can call them that, on the side of segment 2. So not joined up. Irish damselfly goes a little bit further and loses the stalk on the mushroom and has much more dark on the abdominal segments. The dainty damselfly, which is a recent invader and very restricted to North Kent at the moment, has a slightly more restricted version of the variable damselflies, wine goblet we could call it, on segment 2. But it also differs from the other species in that it has 2.5 black segments towards the tip of the abdomen. So in front of those rear blue segments we've got 1, 2 and then half a segment that are black before we get to some more blue going further towards the head. So that 2.5 black segments is worth looking out for. Okay, so let's look at these in a bit more detail. The variable damselfly is quite variable, particularly in the females, of course, as we might expect. It's a very fragmented distribution, but seemingly spreading in parts of the east of its range in England. It's rather more widespread in Ireland. And as I say, it's mostly governed, we think, by alkaline water sources. So where you've got chalk or limestone in the area, draining into lakes or ponds or canals or ditches or even bogs on occasions, the variable might be found. Now you do need to look closely. Generally speaking, the male has these broken blue stripes on top of the thorax. So a really quite dark appearance there generally. And then below that we can see the segment 2 wine goblet, quite a thick wine goblet. And towards the tip of the abdomen, that terminal segment has quite a large area of black, often a sort of bat shape. So there's our broken thorax stripes, looking, if you like, if you want to use your imagination, like daggers dripping with blood. So a drop of blood below the point of the arrow there, dripping down into a wine goblet. So are we reminded of Count Dracula at this point? And if we go to the tip of the abdomen and look at that bat-like shape, maybe that's also looking a little bit like a vampire bat. So okay, so a few little memory joggers there you might like to think of. There's our wine goblet. The female comes in basically a dark form in which the abdomen is mostly black, but this is a blue form, and it does have a little bit more blue at the bases of those abdominal segments than in the blue form of azure damselfly, which is the confusion species. The patterning towards the tip of the abdomen is sometimes distinctive in these, but it is variable. What you really need to look at to be absolutely sure of this is the pronotum. So that's the shield at the back of the head, in front of the thorax, and that has a trilobed rear margin. So that means instead of a rather nice plain smooth curve almost on the rear edge of an azure damselfly, we've got these bulges on the sides and then another little bulge in the center. It's very hard to see, but you can pick it up sometimes with high resolution close images of these. The other thing that's perhaps easier and appears to be reliable is that azure damselflies, both male and female, have a pale bar between the eye spots. So inside from the eyes we can see those sort of pear-shaped spots with a pale line on the female. In the male these are blue, but that seems to be a good mark, and the azure damselfly maybe always lacks that pale line. So even if you can't get the detail of the pronotum, which as I say would be an ideal, then that may help. So that's what we're talking about. Here we've got an azure damselfly, or two different forms actually, different colour stages. so lacking that blue or yellowish line between the eyes. And the rear edge of the pronotum you can see more clearly on the male there. The male azure is rather rounded and not distinctly three lobes. That little red blob, incidentally, is a mite that's found a soft spot to latch onto just there. So there's a graphic illustration of the rear edge of the pronotum of the azure and the variable. In the male you can see it lacks that blue terminal edge, so it's not quite so easy to see the detail because you're often seeing that black central lobe against the black of the thorax. So southern damselfly, or mercury bluet, named after that mercury mark, is extremely localized, often found on very small stretches of streams on heathland typically, but also in Hampshire, Dorset, on chalk rivers or on the ditches and streams associated with the lower stretches of those chalk rivers. So the Avon on the Test Valley. It's a midsummer species, as many of these damselflies are, flying mainly in June and July, and it's also prone to not doing very much until the sun shines. So basically from late morning through to early afternoon on sunny days, nice warm sunny days, these are the times to go looking for southern damselfly. Here's a closer look down at the front end, and we can see those arrow shapes on the abdomen pointing up towards that mercury mark, which is fairly clear even here, seen through the wings. And there's the arrow markings. At least two of the segments will have a rather distinct arrow or rocket shape. The female, I'm afraid, is not very distinctive. It's typically a dark, small, low-flying, rather weak-flying individual. The pronotum is not especially distinctive, and to be honest, the best thing to do is to keep an eye open for the males, as with most dragonfly and damselfly species, most of what you see, nearly all of what you see in most species will be a male. But look out for them, they're not so conspicuous. And of course, if you've got a male in tandem with a female, then it's almost certainly going to be the right species. The segments between the colour between the segments on the abdomen towards the tip are blue. And if you're on a heathland boggy site that's got small red damselfly and you've got the dark form of the small red there, then just be wary that the small red will have red or reddish lines between those segments, and the southern damselfly will have bluish lines. But they are very similar to azure damselfly, dark form, so just be warned, not so easy in the female. The northern damselfly and the Irish damselfly I'm going to cover together. Northern, as you can see, is found in a few locations in Scotland. Being rather northern, it's definitely a midsummer species, flying in June and July, in lakes and smaller water bodies, sometimes boggy water bodies with emergent rushes and sedges. The Irish damselfly is really quite scarce, perhaps scarcer than that map suggests, and restricted to Ireland, and is, as you can see, quite dark, plenty of black markings on the top of the abdomen with those distinctive detached black markings on the side of segment 1. It does tend to be rather greenish on the underside of the thorax in both male and female, and in fact northern damselfly also shares that feature. The dainty damselfly, a recent colonist, I said, basically restricted currently to North Kent. It was traditionally found in Essex at one location, but that was lost in the drastic floods 50 years ago. But we have in the last decade or so seen these appearing at a few locations, only a handful of locations. It's possible that they're overlooked and they are more widespread. They don't have a particularly stringent requirement for their habitat. It's a pond or a ditch, but with quite a lot of pondweed, particularly near the surface where they're often found and will be found egg-laying. They do wander away from water on occasion, so they might just turn up anywhere in a dry location. They are small, as the name dainty suggests, and the males, as I mentioned earlier, have those 2.5 black segments towards the, between the middle of the abdomen outwards, and that rather small wine goblet shape on segment 2. The female, most females tend to look like this. They have quite a lot of blue showing, and they have very distinct rocket shapes on the top of the abdomen. So there's black rocket shapes, and then again there's quite a large patch of blue towards the tip of the abdomen, although some variable damselflies show that as well. But rather distinctive females actually, and well worth keeping an eye open for. Probably prone to blowing around on nice warm breezes, so it could well turn up anywhere in the south after or during a warm spell. Here's that segment 2 marking the small wine goblet. Now, every day you see an emerald is a red letter day. Downy emerald is the more widespread of the 3 emerald species we have in Britain and Ireland. The concentration is in the southeast of England, but there are also some good locations, particularly in the Scottish Highlands. It's an early species. They tend to emerge at pretty much the same time, around the middle of May in the south of England, and that's often a time to find them still at their emergence perches. You can see the male there on the left is bronzy green with some lovely emerald green in places, particularly on the thorax and the eyes. So all the emeralds have lovely green eyes. They're flyers. They're not very keen on perching. So again, it's an even more of a red letter day if you find an emerald dragonfly perched, so you can see it at your leisure. The downy in its name comes from quite a thick coating of hairs on the thorax particularly, and that's an adaptation shown by several early emerging dragonfly species and is thought to help them to warm up on those cool spring days. The male has what we technically call a blobby tip. So the base of the abdomen is rather wasted, quite narrow, and then it expands out towards the tip, right at the tip. And in flight they hold their abdomen tip a little bit higher than the rest of the body, so it looks quite conspicuous. Quite a short abdomen. As I say, these are flyers rather than perchers, so you will often see these flying around the edges of a pond. Ponds and lakes are their favoured habitat, often with tree lines, so the larvae living in the leaf litter very often comes from the overhanging trees, and you may see them flying in and out of the wooded fringe of a pond. They will stop, pause and hover and maybe look at you in a little bay perhaps, and then move on. So there's a rather typical view of one in flight, showing that thickened tip held up above the horizontal. The female, shown there on the right of this illustration, tends to have more parallel sides to the abdomen, and these are not often seen, and often when they are seen, they'll either be grabbed by a male and taken off into the top of a tree to mate, or they'll be egg laying often under the overhanging branches of trees. The brilliant emerald is much more localized, with these fairly discrete areas in the southeast of England and in the Scottish Highlands. It's indeed a very brilliant emerald species, so the whole of the eyes, the thorax and the abdomen are this lovely shiny green colour. Some occasionally may look dark depending on the light and maybe the age. They may go a little bit more bronzy with age. And there are some limited, to be fair, some limited patches of yellow on the side of the thorax and the base of the abdomen. But these you're not generally going to see unless you have an opportunity to see one perched in close-up. Again, the female has very parallel sides to the abdomen, but the male has a much less conspicuous bulge, and it's nearer the middle than the tip of the abdomen, so not as exaggerated a shape as the downy emerald. These tend to be a bit bigger as well, so that abdomen is a little bit more stretched out, I guess. So there we are. That's the sort of widest point is not so near the tip as it is in downy emerald. Females have a very conspicuous ovipositor. Here, this one's been caught and is exuding some eggs, so a batch of eggs that they will dip into usually the margins of their water body, often into a sort of mossy or muddy, organic muddy area. And that almost vertically downward projecting ovipositor is very conspicuous and obviously comes in handy as they're laying these eggs in flight, and tip of the abdomen will be held up almost at right angles to the rest of the abdomen and to get it out of the way, I think, and then the ovipositor being jabbed down repeatedly to lay eggs. But that's a rare sighting indeed. The male northern emerald is very similar to the other emeralds, but much darker, bronzier. It flies over boggy areas, has very, very distinct habitat preferences, so these sphagnum bog moss areas, and they will patrol over and lay eggs into that. The males have a very distinctive tip to the abdomen in that the appendages are caliper shaped, so they look a bit like the rear end of an earwig. But as you can see, very localized and just a tiny presence in Southwest Ireland. The scarce chaser is actually perhaps best referred to now as the blue chaser. Some people have jokingly said the not so scarce chaser, because it has increased its population and spread across the country, particularly southwestwards. And it seems to be continuing that since this map was drawn. There have been further records further to the west. So it's something to look out for. This is a male photographed. It has the classic dark wing bases of a chaser, but they are really very restricted and not so easy to see. They're often to be seen against a dark thorax, which renders them almost invisible. So you need to check that you haven't got a black-tailed skimmer. So the pale blue abdomen looks very like a black-tailed skimmer. It's a little bit fatter, a little bit broader, and not quite so long, not quite so elongated, and the black tip is a little bit more restricted. Some of the scarce chasers, particularly the females and immatures, have dusky tips to their wings, which is a useful feature. And when the males are mature, fully mature, they have these lovely steely blue eyes. So steely blue eyes, relatively broad abdomen, dark wing bases, maybe dark wing tips. The habitat is also a useful thing because they typically like slow-flowing water. So the lowland stretches of rivers and drains, but also increasingly, it seems, moving on to still water or very slow-flowing water in the case of canals. So reedy ponds, lakes, and also reedy ditches and riverbanks is where they're found, the larvae living in the mud at the root, at the base of this emergent vegetation. There's the dark wing bases, not always easy to see. One important thing about scarce chasers is they always perch off the ground, so they're never going to be sat flat on the ground, which is the classic position of a black-tailed skimmer. So if you think you've got a black-tailed skimmer perched knee-high or waist-high up on a piece of vegetation on the side of a watercourse, do look closely at it, because that's quite likely then to be a scarce chaser. Those pale blue-grey eyes, dusky wingtip. Sometimes some males. Here's the broad-bodied chaser, which is the one, of course, we're going to see much more widely and commonly. It has really got a very broad abdomen with much larger dark wing bases, and brown eyes, dark eyes, instead of those steely grey eyes. Incidentally, the black-tailed skimmer has green eyes, or dirty green eyes, nothing like these pale blue-grey eyes on the scarce chaser. And there's the black-tailed skimmer for comparison, typically sitting there on a wooden platform, perched there ready to leap up and chase other skimmers. Scarce chaser doing the same thing, but from a perch. Very occasionally you get black-tailed skimmer up on a perch, but it's quite rare. So just be aware of some of the colour changes happening in dragonflies. There's confusing immature stages. The tenerals, when they first emerge, can look very similar to females. So a young male can be the same colour as a female. This one is showing the shiny wings, so we know it's just emerged a few hours earlier. They have, in this immature and the female form, a series of bell shapes, black bell shapes down the centre of the abdomen. There it is, a little bit older, an immature female with those bell shapes. And as the female matures, she'll go duller. They start off a beautiful fulvous yellow colour with quite extensive yellowish in the wing veins, and then they become dull, sometimes very dull greyish brown colour on the abdomen. This one, of course, retaining the dark wingtips. And there's an immature male, so steadily the waxy pruinescence comes through the cuticle and covers the abdomen. You can see the remnants of yellow down the edges of the abdomen there, but ultimately that will cover the black or most of the black, and certainly that ochre colour to look like that. And there's an unusual one, admittedly, but a very old female, and she's become a little bit pruinose and also got quite pale greyish eyes. But again, those dark wingtips would give you a hint as to what it was. We have a few species of rare darters that are quite mobile and prone to turning up in Britain, particularly during warm southerly or southeasterly airflows. The red-veined darter is the most regular one that we pick up as a migrant or an immigrant, but it does appear to be also colonizing, and every year we have breeding records from a few scattered locations, mainly in the south of Britain, and mainly coastal, to be fair. It has, on the continent and areas further south, it has two distinct generations, maybe even more in the far south. But in Britain, we often don't have a warm enough climate or a warm enough summer to allow a second generation to emerge. So what will happen is there may be an influx in May or June, and then there may be a further influx or emergence in late August and September. That could be that second generation. Another important thing about these is that they appear to be obligate dispersers. So when they emerge, they have an urge to fly away. So the immatures will often be found away from water, and it's very common across the continent, for example, to see them away from water. So again, common darters will do this as well, and some ruddy darters will wander and probably also migrate or turn up on the coast as immigrants. Certainly common darters very often do that. So it's worth keeping your eye open for red-veined. So what makes a red-veined darter? Well, obviously it does what it says on the tin, although they're not always that conspicuous. It has got red wing veins, shown rather clearly here. But it does also have a few other important features. So there on the side of the thorax is a single pale stripe, transverse stripe. The red-veined perches typically like this are like a little flag on the top of a stalk, blowing in the breeze very often. And in those conditions you'll see the pale stripe very easily. But also they spend time, perhaps even more so than common darters, over water, hovering and zooming around over the middle of a pond or lake. And you can actually, through binoculars, often detect that pale line, that pale flash. When you get a good view of one at rest, have a look at the wing spots, and they have very obvious, bold, dark edges at the front and rear of the wing spot. So the wing spot features are also present in females and immatures. The underside of the eyes is blue. Only the rare scarlet darter has blue eyes, blue underneath the eyes. So if you've got a darter, male or female, that's got that little blue patch, you often need to be low down and looking from behind to see it, mind you. And quite nice rufous red thorax and eyes and a pink face. So otherwise, yeah, those are characteristics of ruddy darter rather than common darter. Here's a fairly fresh female, again showing those bold wing spots and rather plain sides to the thorax in the case of these. Compare their top right with a common darter. So the common darter has those two bold yellowish patches separated by darker panels in the male common darter. A darter or whiteface, different genus to the other darters. The small whiteface or white-faced darter is a boreal species, so it belongs in the north of Europe and is found predominantly now in Scotland, in the Highlands. There are a few locations, some have been lost from southern England, but we have literally 3 locations in the northwest Midlands, and I've got a few sites in Cumbria, but the main areas are in the north, the far north, and it's one that is probably going to retreat further with a warmer climate. It's an early emerging species coming out in May and persisting through June and into July. The males are very attractive, black and red, with several features that distinguish them from from the darters, and one of those is dark wing bases, quite small and not necessarily very conspicuous. The male and female both have white faces, not always easy to see unless you're looking head on, but they do have this rather irregular pattern of red in the male and yellow in the female, and also yellow in the immature male. There, showing the upper parts. So very attractive little darters. And another thing to focus on is the white costa. The wing vein across the front of the wing is pale, and there's quite a pale patch just outside the wing spot, so dark wing spots with white lines coming out along the wing veins. There's a female black darter for comparison. So these are found in the same sort of habitat as white-faced darters, at least in lowland boggy areas. They are very much a peat bog specialist, so peaty bog pools in the case of both white-faced darter and the black darter. But the black darter has that black triangle on the top of the thorax and much more yellow visible down the top of the abdomen. From the sides, they can look rather similar to white-faced darters, but I think finding dark wing bases should help. Now, common clubtail isn't a very appropriate name for this species in Britain because it's far from common. It's very localized along the more mature stretches of a few river valleys, including the Thames, the Severn, the Wye, the Dee and the Arun. It's a common species, or the most common, let's say, of the clubtail family across Europe, hence that name. But here a very special creature that's actually quite hard to find. Not only is it localized, but when it emerges from these rivers, it tends to fly away, sometimes several kilometers, into woodland glades and other areas of dense cover where it will feed up and return finally back to the rivers to perch on riverside vegetation, often a leaf like this one, or perhaps even a stone, a rock in the middle of the river, or they may just patrol up and down looking for females. So the clubtails are unique in Britain in that the eyes are separated. So in much the same way that damselfly eyes don't meet, the clubtails don't either. So they have these rather nice green eyes, but then generally black and yellow patterning, quite a lot of black on the abdomen, and quite complex black stripes on the thorax. The clubtail name, of course, comes from the fact that it does expand from a rather narrow base to the abdomen out towards that rather swollen tip. It's an early emerging species, so often emerging in concert from rivers in middle of May, and it will be around until early July. So June is perhaps the best time to see it in its riverside habitats, unless you can catch them emerging along the riverbanks. A common confusion species for those unfamiliar with it is the female or immature black-tailed skimmer, which also has a rather bold black and yellow pattern, although perhaps a richer yellow in the skimmer, whereas the clubtail males at least go a slightly greener shade of yellow. The clubtail, as I said, has complex pattern on the thorax, whereas the black-tailed skimmer is relatively plain and typically sits on the ground rather than high up on a leaf. Now we move on to the hawkers, these big dragonflies that seem to mostly spend quite a lot of time flying. Although the Norfolk hawker, or perhaps more aptly green-eyed hawker, does quite often perch up in tall vegetation like these reeds on the sides of a lake or ditch where they often occur. So as the name suggests, they have been until fairly recently very much an East Anglian specialist around the Norfolk Broads, but thankfully they've moved away from the coast and spread inland to the East Midlands in a few locations. They are traditionally associated with water soldier, which is a plant growing in the ditches of the Norfolk Broads, and in a few locations away from East Norfolk and East Anglia they've been found on lakes with water soldier in them. But also in very recent years they've turned up at reedbed sites in the south of England, so more quite recently in South Devon, for example. And it's expected and hoped that there will be further expansion of the breeding range, because this has been a highly endangered species threatened by sea level rise in East Anglia. Obviously salt water is not a habitat tolerated by our freshwater loving dragonflies. So it's an early season species, emerging in late May and flying in June and into July. It's a brown dragonfly, so a similar base colour to the more common brown hawker, but you can see here these have green eyes and they lack the golden suffusion in the wings that the brown hawker has. And they do patrol, as I say, up and down ditches or around the edges of reedy lakes and ponds, but they will perch up fairly often for a better view. Here's a closer look at a rather duller individual, and you can see at the base of the abdomen there's a yellow triangle shape, an isosceles triangle, that gives the species its scientific name. And those lovely green eyes. And there, for comparison, is a brown hawker, which does have additional pale markings down the abdomen, brown eyes and the golden suffusion on the wings. Brown hawker, a late summer species, I should add, unlike the earlier flight period of the Norfolk hawker. So here's a rather fine small hawker, the southern migrant hawker, that has recently started to turn up in southeast Britain and has been breeding in around the Thames estuary, particularly Essex and Kent, but also appearing to now colonise other locations, including some inland sites. So their ponds and ditches doesn't quite explain their habitat preference, and these males will often be seen on territory in dry areas. Dry areas, admittedly, on the fringes of wetlands, but they will quite often be found away from water. Now that's not to say that other hawkers aren't found away from water as well, which they are, but these will be territorial in these relatively dry areas. So the thing to look for in a southern migrant hawker is that almost entirely unmarked side to the thorax. Is rather attractive, slightly bluish colour. And of course blue is very much a theme in this species, in the male anyway. The blue eyes, the lovely bright blue eyes, much brighter blue than a migrant hawker. And then a lot of blue patterning down the abdomen, again more extensive blue than in the migrant hawker, which is the confusion species. It also flies earlier, so from, I suppose, late summer really, but not persisting into the autumn. So if you've got one in September or October, it's more likely to be a migrant hawker. But one to look out for definitely. The blue eye is a really good mark. The almost unmarked side to the thorax. There's a migrant hawker for comparison, so you can see there in flight the side of the thorax has big yellow patches separated by brown and very different to just those sparse dark lines on the side of the southern migrant hawker. The female, like other female hawkers, tends to be dark brown and yellow, though occasionally there are blue forms, as there are in the other hawkers, that may resemble the males. There's the female migrant hawker for comparison. So again, note the plain sides to the thorax in the southern migrant hawker, whereas the migrant hawker has the brown and yellow stripes on the side. The azure hawker is a threatened species in Britain, found only in the Scottish Highlands. It's very much a bog specialist, and there are concerns about its survival in a drier climate, particularly if bogs start to dry out. There is a question mark over whether it still exists in south-west Scotland. It hasn't been seen there for a number of years, but it's a midsummer species taking advantage of what sunshine can be found in Scotland, often, perhaps most often, encountered away from water, perched on or basking on a plain subject like a tree bark or even a plank of wood. And there the males showing extensive areas of blue on the abdomen, but almost no markings on the top of the thorax. And again in the female, so compare, for example, with a common hawker, which would be the other possibility here, although flying later in the year mainly. But female common hawkers would show a little bit more yellow on the top of the thorax. The right-hand one has a white line pointing to the eyes, and the eyes on azure hawker meet in a narrow point. There's the common hawker male for comparison, so nowhere near as much blue on the male, and it is a big dragonfly, the common hawker, but often found in similar habitats on the moorland. The azure hawker quite small by comparison. And there's the female common hawker, so usually showing some small stripes on top of the thorax, and a yellow costa. It's a brownish costa on the azure hawker female. And there's azure hawker in flight. So they have very distinctive, wiggly blue lines on the side of the thorax in the case of the male. So nowhere near like the bold, straighter stripes you get on the common hawker. There's the common hawker for comparison. The lesser emperor has occurred quite widely in Britain, even turned up on the Scottish Islands on occasions as a vagrant during hot weather plumes coming from the continent. It's one of two emperors with, at least in the males, a conspicuous blue saddle, blue base to the abdomen. They typically turn up during midsummer, and males will often be pursued by emperor dragonflies when they occur in the same habitat, which is reedy lakes and ponds typically. The lesser emperors, however, have very obvious brown thorax. So if you think you've got a lesser emperor, do focus on the colour of the thorax. Pretty bright green in the case of the emperor dragonfly, brown in lesser emperor, and the blue typically just restricted to the base of the abdomen in these. The wings often a little bit suffused, as in this individual, and the eyes rather duller than in the emperor. But certainly we think breeding at a few locations now, mainly in the southeast, so worth keeping an eye open for, and mostly turning up as males, and admittedly therefore mostly migrant males. There's one in flight, so you can see the obvious brown thorax contrasting with that blue saddle that goes right round. The emperor, by comparison, the green thorax and the blue visible typically all the way along the side of the abdomen. Okay, so just a word or two about the British Dragonfly Society. We educate, record and conserve dragonflies. We have a very good and useful website. We maintain a database of all of Britain's dragonfly records, and you can contribute to those, particularly if you think you've seen some of those rare ones, by submitting your sightings and indeed any photos to iRecord, which is run, operated and maintained by the Biological Records Centre. All of those records are at least annually moved up to the National Biodiversity Network Atlas, the NBN Atlas, and they're accessible to anyone. So you can go onto the NBN Atlas and search for dragonfly records in your local area, for example, and make use of those records. Okay, thank you very much for listening and watching, and don't forget, if you want to read a bit more about these species, then there is this rather good book available. Thank you.